Lieutenant Greg Sanders thought this was going to be just another routine stop. Another arrogant black man who believed he was above the law. Sanders had done this before, and he had no intention of slowing down now. But what he didn't know was that within a few hours, his entire career would implode. The country would soon know his name, but not for reasons he'd be proud of. You see, he hadn't just slapped handcuffs on any ordinary driver that day. He had arrested the Attorney General. What unfolded next sent shockwaves through the entire nation. But to understand how it all happened, we need to go back to the very beginning. The stop. Lieutenant Greg Sanders leaned back in his patrol car, stretching as he stared out at the empty highway. The afternoon shift had been long and uneventful, and boredom gnawed at his nerves. He wanted something, anything, to break up the monotony. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel in rhythm with his thoughts. Then he saw it. A sleek black sedan cruised past, moving just a little quicker than the rest of the sparse traffic. Sanders narrowed his eyes. The vehicle was too polished, too confident, and the man behind the wheel. Sanders didn't like the look of him one bit. A black man, late 30s, early 40s. Tailored suit, sunglasses. Hands resting casually on the wheel like he didn't have a care in the world. Got one, Sanders muttered to himself. With practiced ease, he flicked on the patrol lights. The sedan's brake lights lit up immediately, and it eased over to the shoulder without hesitation. Sanders smirked. Compliance was good, but he hated it when they acted like they had nothing to hide, like they thought they were innocent. He approached the driver's side window with deliberate slowness, tapping the glass twice with his knuckles. License and registration. The window rolled down smoothly. The man inside handed over his documents without a word, his movements calm, measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked. Sanders didn't like the tone. It was polite, but direct, too direct. "You were speeding," Sanders lied, keeping his voice flat. "I was going 35 in a 40 zone," the man replied, raising one eyebrow. There it was. That tone. Sanders hated it when they talked back like they were equals, like they thought they knew the rules better than he did. He glanced inside the car. Spotless. No open containers. No drugs. No weapons. No obvious infractions. "Damn. Step out of the vehicle," Sanders ordered. "On what grounds?" the man asked, still composed. Sanders scowled. "Don't make me use force." The man gave a small sigh, then opened the door and stepped out. "You're making a mistake, officer." "Oh, I'll decide what's a mistake," Sanders sneered. He spun the man around, twisted his arm behind his back, and slapped the cuffs on with unnecessary force. "You're under arrest for resisting," Sanders barked, though the man hadn't resisted at all. But something about the way the man looked at him, steady, assessing, without fear, sent a ripple of unease down Sanders' spine. "You'll regret this," the man said quietly. Sanders chuckled and led him toward the patrol car. "Sure I will." He had no idea how prophetic those words would turn out to be. At the station, Sanders led his detainee down the precinct's main hallway, savoring the moment. This was the part he loved most, when they realized they were really in trouble. "Take a seat, boss," Sanders said mockingly, shoving the man into a hard plastic chair in one of the interrogation rooms. The man sat upright, hands resting calmly on the table, his face unreadable. His name, Sanders learned as he began filling out paperwork, was Nathaniel Carter. The name gave Sanders pause for half a second. It sounded familiar, but he shrugged it off. "You act like you're special," Sanders said with a smirk. "Think that fancy suit impresses anybody around here?" Carter glanced at him with something resembling amusement, but said nothing. That silence unsettled Sanders more than he wanted to admit. He was used to detainees begging for phone calls or shouting about their rights. But this guy, he was quiet, calm, controlled. "Okay, mister." "Big shot," Sanders muttered and left the room, heading toward the duty desk. Officer Ray Coleman was at the computer, entering the usual booking data. Suddenly, Coleman froze, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. "Greg," Coleman whispered. "You know who you just brought in, right? What are you talking about?" Sanders frowned. Coleman didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned the monitor toward Sanders. "There, staring back at him from the official state database, was Nathaniel Carter's photo. Underneath it, in bold capital letters, State Attorney General. Sanders felt his stomach twist into a hard knot. "No," he said quietly. "That can't be." Coleman's voice was tight. "That's him. You arrested the guy who oversees law enforcement for the entire state. The guy who prosecutes corruption and abuse of power." A sheen of cold sweat broke out on Sanders' forehead. "Maybe he won't make a big deal out of this." Coleman didn't laugh. "Look outside." Sanders turned toward the window. Reporters. Cameras. Microphones. A mob of them had already gathered outside the precinct doors. Before he could process it, the interrogation room door opened. Nathaniel Carter stepped out, flanked by Lieutenant Harris and Chief Montgomery. "Officer Sanders," Carter said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I suggest you hire a good lawyer." He pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the desk next to Sanders' hand. "And," Carter added, leaning in slightly, "I will be personally attending your hearing." Sanders stood there, stunned, as Carter walked past him. Outside, the flash of cameras was blinding. Reporters shouted questions, but Carter ignored them, slipping into an unmarked car that pulled away smoothly. In that moment, Sanders knew his career was over. The trial. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches, cameras clicked, and spectators murmured as they waited for the scandalous case to begin. At the defense table, Greg Sanders sat stiffly in his uniform, face pale and tense. He'd been told this was just a formality, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. Then the doors swung open. Nathaniel Carter entered, moving with slow confidence, dressed in a flawless dark suit. He owned the room with his presence alone, and the whispering crowd fell silent as he took his place at the prosecution table. Sanders' eyes met Carter's. There was no anger there, no bruating, only cold, clinical calculation. "Court is now in session," the judge announced. "This is the case of the unlawful arrest of Attorney General Nathaniel Carter by Lieutenant Gregory Sanders." Carter stood. "Your Honor, I request that this trial be fully public. Let the people see the process." The judge nodded. "Granted." The first piece of evidence was the dash cam footage. Sanders watched the screen in horror as his own actions played out for the world to see. There he was, ordering Carter out of the car without cause. There he was, slapping cuffs on him without resistance. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. "Lieutenant Sanders," Carter said, his voice even, "you claimed I resisted arrest. Do you see any resistance in this footage?" Sanders' throat was dry. "Not exactly. You fabricated the charges." "I was doing my job," Sanders snapped, immediately regretting it. The judge banged the gavel. "Order." Carter continued. "This isn't just about one bad arrest. This is about a system that has tolerated misconduct for far too long." The trial was over quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Sanders was suspended on the spot. A criminal case for abuse of power was opened against him. As Carter walked out of the courtroom, he didn't even spare Sanders a glance. The fall. 2 weeks passed. Greg Sanders sat in his dingy apartment, watching news reports of his downfall. His name was everywhere. Headlines screamed about police corruption and racism. His badge no longer worked at the precinct. No one returned his calls. At headquarters, he faced the commissioner and the legal team. "You're under investigation," the commissioner said. "Not just for Carter's arrest. For everything. We reviewed your cases. The complaints. The footage. You're throwing me away," Sanders said bitterly. "You're a liability," the commissioner replied coldly. "We need a clean slate." Charges followed. Excessive force. Falsified reports. Racial profiling. His lawyer was blunt. "Take a plea deal. Probation. But you'll never wear a badge again." Sanders refused, until they played the recording of his own voice. "They're always hiding something. Keep them scared." There was no setup, just consequences. The verdict. The courtroom was full again for his final trial. Cameras captured every second. Greg Sanders stood as the judge read the verdict. "Guilty on all counts. You are barred from law enforcement and sentenced to 3 years probation." As the room erupted in murmurs and applause, Sanders stared at the floor. Carter watched him quietly. No anger. No triumph. just satisfaction. They crossed paths in the hallway one last time. Happy now? Sanders growled. Justice has been served, Carter said simply. The system didn't fail you, Sanders. It's just not protecting you anymore. And then he walked away, leaving Sanders to face the wreckage of his own making.